I'm going to talk to you now about ratification in New York State. Of the four big and crucial states, probably the anti-federalists were strongest in the state of New York. And I have to talk a little bit about the history of New York during the Revolutionary period and during the 1780s in order to explain that. First of all, New York had a very dynamic, very powerful governor at this time, George Clinton. George Clinton had begun from relatively humble origins. He had worked his way up to some degree of affluence by the beginning of the Revolution. He was a militia leader, militia officer, became governor of New York State during the Revolutionary War, and really held New York State together during the war. And you have to understand that New York State was a state truly besieged during that conflict. It was divided between loyalists and revolutionaries. For much of the war, New York City was occupied by the British, starting in the summer of 1776 until the last outpost that the British evacuated in November 1783. It was the scene of one of the most important, largest invasions when General Burgoyne marched his army from Canada into upstate New York and was defeated at Saratoga. It was the scene also of numerous raids by Native Americans along the frontier because the powerful Iroquois, many of the Iroquois had sided with the British. It was a state which was truly year in, year out throughout the Revolutionary War under tremendous pressure. And as a part of that, when New Yorkers wrote their state constitution, they created a fairly powerful governor. And George Clinton was that governor. He was a giant of a man. He was as tall as George Washington, big man who was a very important political presence. And he was a very dynamic leader. And during the 1780s, he remained governor of the state of New York. And he put New York in an incredibly strong position. His economic policies, they had seized vast millions of dollars worth of loyalist states, sold that land, and then used that money to support the state government during the Revolutionary War and in the years immediately after. New York State had created impost, that is a tax on imports. And I mentioned in a previous lecture that the smaller states like New Jersey and Connecticut were paying imports on goods brought in through the New York City and then shipped out to those other states. And he was generating revenue through this impost. Many states had created paper currencies during the Revolutionary War and the years immediately after, and they had become highly inflationary. But because of the strong economic base in New York, the paper currency of New York State was very strong and held its value at par, which of course the continental currency did not. One of the provisions of the Constitution, I should point out, said that states will no longer be able to print their own currency. He had also begun to pay off the state debt, the money that had been borrowed by New York State during the Revolutionary War. And not only that, he took over New York's share of the national debt. One of the things that Alexander Hamilton did during the 1790s is he assumed all the various state debts. Well, New York was not only paying its own state debt, but it had also begun to pay its share of the national debt during the 1780s. And so from Clinton's point of view, the strong, powerful governor, it's like, well, what do we really need this US Constitution for? And he opposed the Constitution. And so this individual Clinton and the strong state government in New York combined to make, well, the Constitution seemed to be less necessary to many people in the state of New York, which explains the strong anti-federalist support, or opposition, I should say, to the US Constitution. However, Clinton in January, on January 11th, did send the Constitution to the state legislature where he had tremendous influence. And that state legislature in turn I believe on February 1, forwarded the Constitution, well, allowed a constitutional convention to be elected. But they set that election for the normal election cycle. The normal election cycle in New York State at this time would be running for the last few days of April and the first couple of days in May. So notice the timeline here is being pushed further and further back, which the Anti-Federalists thought was to their advantage, but actually probably turned out to be to their disadvantage because of that momentum that was beginning to build as one state after another began to ratify the convention. Two other things the state legislature did to strengthen the Anti-Federalist position is, one, they broadened the right to vote for the state convention. So it was easier for men, in other words, men had a lower property qualification to vote for the state convention than they did for the state legislature. So more people would be voting, and since so many people thought the Constitution was anti-democratic, they thought that that would lead to more Anti-Federalists being elected into the state convention. And the other thing they did is that when they sent it out to the different communities, when they published the call for the state convention, they included the letter that was sent by two members of the Constitutional Convention from New York who had left the convention because they didn't like what was going on. Robert Yates and John Lansing had left the convention. Only Alexander Hamilton remained, who of course was a strong Federalist. And they gave reasons why they opposed the Constitution. Both sides, both the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, became very organized in New York. They actually formed committees. They put together slates of officers. Newspaper debate was very intense. The Federalist Papers are a part of that newspaper debate, but not that crucial part of it. John Jay, for example, one of the authors of the Federalist Papers, writes an essay in April 1788, which is much greater, published much greater and had a much greater effect than the Federalist Papers in general. Many Anti-Federalist Papers essays were published in newspapers in New York. The end result was that when the election was finally held, 46 of the delegates were clearly committed, identifiably committed to opposing the Constitution, and only 19, mainly from in and around New York State, were supporters of the Constitution. Some of those people said, let's get it over with, let's vote. And had they voted on the first day, the vote would have been 46 to 19 against the Constitution. And that's a pretty stark situation. Of course, Federalists said, well, no, let's not just do that. And some of the Anti-Federalists agreed, okay, we can debate it. And as they did in several other states, they decided they would debate it sort of provision by provision, sentence by sentence, paragraph by paragraph, and then the debates began. But in some ways, now the convention meets in late June, I believe, June 17th is when it begins. So don't hold me to that date, and lasts until July 26th or 27th. So it goes for over a month, and that's a very important month, especially when you keep in mind of when other states are ratifying, in particular New Hampshire and Virginia. They begin this debate in provision by provision, and in some ways, some of the Federalists begin to overplay the hand. As was true in Massachusetts and elsewhere, some of the Federalists were extremely articulate. Alexander Hamilton, Robert Livingston, member of a very prominent family, very high government official in the state of New York, had been very important during the Revolutionary War and Continental Congress. These men argued vehemently for the Constitution, but perhaps a bit too arrogantly. More plain spoken were some of the Anti-Federalists, but they were not country bumpkins like they were in Massachusetts. They were fairly articulate, fairly persuasive, fairly effective. people like especially Melancton Smith, a very important person in this story, and Robert Yates, no, excuse me, John Lansing, not Robert Yates, John Lansing were articulate spokesmen for the Anti-Federalists. George Clinton, who opposed it, who was at the convention, did not participate that actively in the debates. He operated more behind the scenes. Sometimes you might wonder, why would people like George Clinton do that? But part of it was that Clinton felt that it was sort of beneath his dignity to get involved in the debates, per se. He would rather let other people be the people arguing while he himself stayed back. Debates over issues of representation, debates over the issue of state power, debates over a whole variety of issues, Bill of Rights. These were the kinds of things that the Anti-Federalists made very good cases for. There was a Federalist who was more effective than Alexander Hamilton and Robert Livingston, and that was John Jay, one of the most educated people of his era, very experienced in foreign policy, but also open and willing to talk to some of the other Anti-Federalists, and was more kind of a compromiser and deal maker. So it's really, more than anything else, it was the extended nature of these debates, extending the time frame that let the momentum of the other states come into play. When news of New Hampshire, which I believe arrives on June 24th, of the New Hampshire ratification came, the Federalists said, well, now it's a done deal. Are we in or out? Still, the Anti-Federalists said, no, I think we're going to be out. Then when news of Virginia's ratification arrived on July 2nd, again, the Federalists felt that their situation had been greatly enhanced, and it was, but it took a while. It took a while. By this time, many of the Anti-Federalists were saying, okay, we'll ratify only on the condition, and here's that language becomes so important, that the following amendments be included. And then they created a list of amendments. And we will ratify only on the condition, and that condition word is absolutely essential. But several Anti-Federalists began to waver. Absolutely crucial here was Melancton Smith, who had been the major spokesman for the Anti-Federalists throughout the month of June into July. And on July 14th, Smith kind of was looking at this situation, and he said, you know, this Constitution is in place. The representatives from the city of New York were actually talking about seceding from the state of New York. And New York State without New York City was going to be a much weaker place and could not generate the kind of revenue that it had been generating beforehand. And he says, you know, okay, we will accept the Constitution with proposed amendments and a proposal for having a new convention, a proposal which was not followed through on, a new convention to discuss those amendments. Melancton Smith changed his mind and supported the Constitution. Votes was held on Melancton Smith's position that the idea that the Constitution would be ratified with proposed amendments and a proposed convention was accepted by the Federalists. And on July 26th, 1787, it was ratified with a vote. Now listen to how close this was. Many of the Anti-Federalists had left to go home and work on their farms. The vote was 30 to 27. So close was the Constitution ratified. Now there were 11 states that were part of the new United States of America. Thank you.
Freedom 101 is made possible by generous support from the University of Oklahoma Alumni Association. Freedom 101 is a program of the Institute for the American Constitutional Heritage at the University of Oklahoma. For more videos and podcasts, visit freedom.ou.edu.